I'm Bob Rubin. I'm going to be moderating our final panel. Heard discussions of two relatively specific policy areas with respect to higher education, and now we'll turn to the broader and full panoply of issues affecting the sector. We just frame this by saying that Fareed Zakaria, in a book he wrote, I think it was his last book, said that higher education was the one area of the United States best and most retained its both comparative and absolute advantage relative to the rest of the world. It seems to me that that is correct, and it's been of extraordinary service to our country and its citizens. On the other hand, we are also at a time of tremendous change in the conditions that affect higher education. Sources of revenue, technology, globalization, questions about the very purposes of education, and so much else. So clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, but it would seem that we are likely to be the beginnings of a period of very substantial change in this vitally important sector. To discuss all of these issues, we are deeply honored to have the leaders of three of America's great institutions of higher learning: Francis Cigarroa, University of Texas; Thomas Roth, University of North Carolina; and Michael Roth, Wesleyan University. So what we're going to do is I'm going to throw out one question for each of them. After each response, we'll have a discussion, then we'll go on to the next one, and so forth. Then I'll throw out some questions generally, and then we'll turn to you all. In addition, we have questions coming in from Twitter, so we are very modern at the Hamilton Project. Okay, I'm not, but they are. Let's start with a comment that Michael Roth made to me on the phone the other day, and he said that to think of higher education as one unit is somewhat misleading. It's actually a highly disaggregated sector. And to focus on that, Francis, why don't we talk about the changing demographics of America, in which Texas certainly is a pioneer, and the effects that has on education. How do you at the University of Texas, with your many, many campuses, accommodate these changes and serve these changes so that all of our people in a time of tremendous demographic change are well served, which obviously is enormously in the interest of the nation? Your nickel.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be here. There is no doubt that Texas is a rapidly growing state and also reflects a population that would be reflective of the demography of this nation, just I think a little sooner than the rest of the nation. And when you take a look at higher education, at least from my perspective, is that we can't just be in silos. I mean, let's just say we have a responsibility of addressing the K through 16 perspective, that's also part of our responsibility. So what is University of Texas doing in this regards? Well, first of all, we did have a little opportunity to hear this morning about the importance of teachers and how important our universities are in educating a superb cohort of teachers to educate our pipeline of students, which are going to be in K through 12. So I have been able to advocate very strongly and have gotten funding from our board to expand the You Teach program. And that is really allowing great teachers, specifically in the STEM fields, to be educating a large cohort of high schools across the nation. The second aspect, with many students who are first-time generation students, is we have a responsibility to work very closely with our community colleges. Not every student coming out of high school is going to go to a four-year university right off the bat, and we've heard about finances, and in many ways, this is a way to also have a more affordable baccalaureate degree by spending some time in community college. The other aspect that I have felt has been very, very important is in the role of advising. And of course, this is very important to all students, but really very important to our first-time generation students whose parents or grandparents have no idea of how to navigate this process. And we took a hard look at this. And what I found out was really terrifying from my perspective is that we have one student advisor on the average for every 450 or 500 students. And if you go to a more underserved region, it's 1 to 670. So how are we going to better advise our students? And here is an area where, in fact, we can do better in making certain that students understand if they're transferring from community college, what credits will actually count towards their degree. Second is really be far more transparent about the financial costs. And there are ways of doing that, as we heard earlier this afternoon. The third aspect is, in addition to that, is advising students, first-time generation students and others, about job opportunities downstream. The other aspect that the University of Texas is doing is, if you take a look at Texas, as a whole, we have a responsibility of comprehensive universities, emerging research universities, and our flagship. And we have 2 public flagships, or 2 AAU universities that are public in Texas, and 1 private AAU, which is Rice. We are losing 10,000 students a year because our flagships, our public flagships, are at capacity. So do we have a responsibility as a state to provide more strategic flagship universities across the state, such that students don't have to travel to Austin or to Houston or to College Station? So we are making investments in that regard. So to answer your question, this is a multifaceted issue, and you can't just look at one solution. You've got to take a look at this whole issue comprehensively, and you've got to set goals and priorities and stick with them.
We had not met before, Francisco, but we talked about this panel, and I asked a friend of mine who is the president of a large university about the university systems in the country, and she said that you were a great change agent in the respects that you just mentioned. How receptive, and I'll throw this out to all of you just to follow up on Francisco's comments, how receptive is higher education to change? The publishing industry, well, I mean, it's not a legitimate question. The publishing industry decided they didn't have to change, and they don't exist today. The newspaper side, they didn't have to change, they don't exist today. And now we have higher education, which is massively important to our country and very, very strong. Would the two of you like to follow up on Francisco's comment with respect to receptivity to change and the directions you think it's going to be taking?
Well, I've had the privilege of leading a small liberal arts college and now a large university system, and I think I found actually both of them to be more receptive to change than we give them credit for. I think our faculties and even our alumni know the world is changing. And so they know, in maybe not in specific ways that we have to change, but they know that we need to change. So I think we can be receptive. I also think, though, that we have to be cautious and careful and not overreact. I think having goals and plans, as Francisco says, and targeting and having metrics against which we can judge ourselves are important. But because higher education in the United States has been a leader in the world, if not the leader in the world, we should be careful how quickly we change. Be sure the changes are the right ones and that are moving us in a positive direction and not change for change's sake.
Tom, let me ask you a related question, and then I'll turn to Michael. I know, because I've read a little bit about you, that you've been an advocate for thinking about education not only, although very importantly, as preparation for post-graduation employment, but also for its own broader values, to think about ourselves, understand the world we live in, to be prepared to be good citizens, et cetera. When you deal with your legislature, because you are publicly funded, how do you explain that to those who fund you at a time of tremendous pressure on their constituents?
Apparently not too well, as our funding has been going down, so something I have to improve on, I think. I think there are some pretty strong correlations between higher education and lots of measures that positively affect a community. So we know that people with a college degree are more engaged in their community. They volunteer more often. They're more civically engaged. We know their health outcomes are better. There's less obesity, less smoking. We know that they are less dependent on public services, public benefits. We know their incarceration rates are less. So there's a lot of positive benefit to society that comes along with education. And I think we have to make that case. We have to show that that's true. I think particularly this is true of public research universities, that we contribute in many ways to our state's economies and to the national economy. And it goes beyond the classroom. And as we were talking earlier, a large part of the research engine of the United States has been transferred to universities in America. And I think our legislators don't always, I think, remember that or is aware of that if they've come from outside of our state. But we have if there's one thing besides basketball that North Carolina is known for, it's the Research Triangle Park. It's the place where universities and the private sector have come together and built an economy. And it's that partnership that's so important. So we try to remind them of that, try to remind them of their previous investments and what that's done for the economy of the state, much less these other benefits that I think can be so valuable to our communities.
And when you do that, Tom, do you get traction?
Yeah, I think we do. I think they're, particularly because of the last 4 or 5 years, most legislators are worried about creating jobs. They ran for office, we're going to create more jobs. And I think when they get in the position of having to make policy decisions, they slowly realize, sometimes I wish they learned it faster, that education is as important to the infrastructure of a state and of an economy as highways and airports and water and all the other things that you need to have a viable ecosystem and viable economy. And so as they learn that and they realize the interconnection between universities and the economy, then I hope over time they will realize that we've got to invest more. And I think the other thing that people are beginning to more completely understand is that this is a competition, really. And that's the way I put it with people. I said, we're in the talent production business, and if you want to be competitive with the rest of the world and with other states, then we better be producing the best talent possible, and we better produce enough of it to be able to meet the demands of the workforce. And so I think when you put it in those competitive terms, you get more positive feedback.
Michael, I'm saving my hardest for last. Let me come back to Francisco for one moment. If you take a look at the experience you described a moment ago, and then you also think of your interactions with your legislature, because you also are a great public institution, what lessons can be drawn from what you're doing for universities around the world, around the country, as they deal with the questions of demographic change, but also with the cost pressures that they face and the other very substantial changes that are taking place in the world, including, as Tom started to suggest, global competition from universities are going to be well funded in China and UAE and so forth.
So,
The president comes to you and he or she says to you, what lessons can I take from your experience?
well, and I'd like to kind of go back as to how we work with our faculty and our staff and our students in regards to implementing change. And I've learned a lot in the past 5 years. We have had a very engaged Board of Regents who have really provided a sense of urgency and very quickly put out what is a return on investment in regards to education and research. Should we separate that? Should we? And it really startled the faculty a lot in a big way. But it did catalyze a very important conversation, which basically resulted, in order to get your faculty to support you, you really had to actually establish a framework of priorities and goals that they realized were important to accomplish in order to be able to garner the public trust and garner the legislative trust as well. And it resulted from basically what is our responsibility in transformational learning, whether it's blended or online or MOOCs. It resulted in asking the questions about how are we evaluating our faculty? Are our post-tenure review processes actually adequate or not? In fact, under the University of Texas system, the best you could get was satisfactory. And I actually thought that was insulting for a great faculty member. And I said, wouldn't you rather be rated as exceeding expectations? And so we actually, 98% of people would fall into the satisfactory category. So we were able to work with the faculty to actually change the post-tenure review process. Finally, in regards to how important it is to garner legislative trust, and I conveyed to you a little earlier today that boards and legislatures, are changing. Our board is no longer a more senior statesman. Our board is a younger group, cohort of individuals who are very data-driven and want answers yesterday. And one of the issues that I learned is that we did not really have a good system-wide Office of Research that allowed us to capture reliable data that you can actually be consistent. One thing I've learned about the legislature is that when you give them a statement, but they hear 3 or 4 different statements that differ, suddenly there's mistrust. And so one of the issues that we had to put forth is developing a dashboard that's taking a look at productivity from a variety of different levels. And I will tell you, I got a lot of pushback. People were a bit reluctant to share data, which is going to be open entirely to the public. And there were months and months and months of conversations. So I've actually been surprised that if you work with your faculty and your staff and your students understanding that the world is changing, you can get receptiveness, but you're going to get pushback. And when you get pushback, the other thing I've learned is you've got to get the support of your board. Otherwise, this whole thing starts, everybody starts quivering, and the football doesn't get across the goal line.
Gets more complicated when your board doesn't support you, I would guess.
It never works out well.
This was not a question I had planned to ask, but I just can't help, out of curiosity, just forces me to ask you the question. When you do a post-tenure review and the review turns out to be unsatisfactory, what do you do?
Okay. Well, if a review comes out unsatisfactory, then there's a remediation plan. And then you revisit the performance of that faculty member within a specific time frame. And if that remediation plan fails, then basically there is a process by which leadership gathers their peers and results in a process that ultimately only the governing board can remove a tenured faculty member. Mm-hmm. But there is a process for that. I've just always felt that, and here's the experience that I had. It's an N of 1, but it was real. So when I became a young faculty member at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, I said, well, it seems like I should be on the tenure track. Or that's what my department chair said, I think you ought to be on the tenure track. That was the last advice I got until 5 years later when I was up for post-tenure review. Well, I was up for promotions and tenure, and suddenly they said, well, you haven't written enough, you haven't done this, and yet for 5 years, there was absolutely no feedback. And so I'm a strong believer that part of the responsibilities of a university is to nurture your young faculty and give them the best advice. Otherwise, the department chair is failing. And so part of this process is to make sure that there's interactions between a faculty member and the department chair, that expectations are set. It's a bilateral conversation. Then you set goals, and then you assess, and you measure outcomes. I think when you do it that way, people understand where people stand, and it's not a surprise. So I was actually very pleased we were able to change the post-tenure review process at the University of Texas system when everybody told me, run away from that. I just couldn't. In medicine, we are measured in many different ways. And I thought that it was only right to value or to assess a faculty member the correct way. And I thought to assess a Nobel laureate as satisfactory was not right.
Well, I know we've all known a number of Nobel laureates, some of them I'm not sure. But anyway, leave that aside. Michael, the world changeth. What do you think higher education is going to look like 5 years from now? How do MOOCs fit into that? How does globalization? I think Tom mentioned globalization, competition from China and the UAE. Anything else that strikes you? Oh, and as long as you're doing that. Now you start with that, then I'll my follow-up.
I first want to say that we've been hearing for the last few years, seems like a free ticket to publishing a business book, that we need disruptive innovation in the world of colleges and universities. It's going to look a lot like record companies or newspapers, and that people write, I guess who had not had the benefit of history courses in college, that universities and colleges haven't changed since the medieval times. This is really ridiculous. Colleges and universities have changed dramatically in the last 30, 40 years, and they keep changing. The composition of our faculties are different. The composition of the student body is different. When I started at Wesleyan as an undergraduate in 1975, we had just started admitting women. And now in the last panel, we hear the big problem is that women are doing too well. But nothing has changed in universities. 90% of the people we hired last year at Wesleyan for the faculty were women. But nothing has changed in universities. Teaching techniques are completely different. I have alumni yelling at me all the time because you're not keeping things the same. You're not keeping things the same in the government department. When I took economics in 1967, we learned these things, and now you're not teaching accounting like I had it. I think that these misinformed notions of the pace of change in American higher education are harmful for understanding the real challenges we have. We do have challenges in the United States about access to quality education. Most of those challenges have to do with income inequality and the persistence of poverty across the country. And colleges and universities will not solve the poverty problem in America, nor will it solve the problem of entitlement and the concentration of wealth among people who think luxury is the same thing as learning. These are big problems. These are widespread problems. And I see at colleges that I know, and many of them are small places, but also at public institutions, a concentrated effort by faculty and even some administrators. We always like to, people like me and presidents, we like to make fun of the faculty when they're not around. And they're not here for the most part. But it's really, the faculty are often the engine of change because they see what's not working in the classroom. They see what is happening in their own fields, where what's happening in biophysics this year is not the same thing that was happening in, nothing was happening in biophysics apparently when I was a student. At least I didn't know about it. These things are changing all the time. And I do think American colleges and universities would be wise to use their methods of assessing change and assessing student learning to understand, one, how we could have more access to high-quality education for a broader range of the United States population and not give in to what I heard one of the panelists say at the last panel, that we have a romantic notion of college education in America and that some people shouldn't go to college because they should go to technical school and we shouldn't, and they should be boys, I suppose, because only boys biologically are oriented to technology things. Have to come to Washington to hear this. And that this kind of retreat from the goal of a democratic, high-quality education for all citizens of the country, or perhaps even all the people who live in the country, who might choose to do different things with their education, who might not become professors, of course, who might become mechanics, of course, who might work in technology, of course. But whatever they wind up doing, that they deserve a high-quality education that would allow them to be productive and participating citizens in the polity. It's not just about what they're going to earn. It's about holding people accountable for leadership in the country. And every time I hear people talking about the retrenchment from the goal of access to a high-quality education, I think that's about keeping people with privilege immune to criticism, which is what Thomas Jefferson thought, which is what Ben Franklin thought. It's an old debate in this country. But when we hear today, under the guise of technological savvy or neuroscience about boys, that we should limit access to higher education or high-quality education to a chosen few, I just want to make sure that my checkbook is still in my pocket.
Michael, let me ask you a question, because I'm associated with one university where they have massively increased student aid. And I would very much identify with the objective that you set out. But there is the question, how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah, there is.
And how would you address that?
Well, we do have to find we at highly selective colleges and universities, we do have to find ways of attracting students that don't depend on spending large amounts of money on counter-educational practices, like really cool dorms with great activities in the evening, which don't necessarily lend themselves actually to learning. So there are many ways at the fancy places where we can change our priorities and I think still attract really great students. At schools that are really trying to educate many, many more students than we can educate at a small place like Wesleyan, they need more funding. I don't think I was saying this over lunch, you're not going to try to build a helicopter for $10,000. I don't think you should try to build high-quality education for the poor on a meager resources. It takes investment. We heard about some of those investments.
Michael, I totally agree with you. Where will the money come from?
It'll come from the public sector. It'll come from taxation.
Well, you may be, I
Or
agree
it
with
won't
you.
come.
No, I agree with you conceptually. At the present time, there doesn't seem to be tremendous public enthusiasm for increased taxes. is my
There isn't.
impression.
There isn't. There's tremendous public enthusiasm for high defense spending. I guess that's why we have it.
Michael, I think you and I would agree totally, except trouble, neither of us run the government.
I realize that, but I'm not saying that it's very likely.
Let's assume for the moment, which hopefully will not turn out to be the case, but let's assume that the political dynamic doesn't change enormously over the next 5 or 10 years. How is higher education going to change to accommodate what may be sort of a continuation of existing paucity of federal or state resources? Actually, I know North Carolina certainly faces. Not every university can be located in a state with oil and gas, which Francisco forgot to mention is one of the aspects of the University of Texas that's not irrelevant. But how are we going to deal with this? I think everything you said is exactly right. But the question is, how does our university system adapt so that we can do the kinds of things you want to do, given that the revenues... Tom, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think, first of all, we can't look at this in isolation, and we can't look at it just as an issue for higher education. This is a societal dilemma that we face. And what we've seen over the last 25 or 30 years is a dramatic spike in what we spend on healthcare and corrections. At the same time, we've seen a reduction in what we spend on higher education. So I think we have to have the debate and the discussion in this country of what are our priorities and how are we going to address them at the macro level. So that's the first thing. I do think we have to be more efficient, and I think there are ways that we can do that. We've worked hard over the last 5 years. We brought in about every consultant there is, I think, Bain, McKinsey, all of them. And we are more efficient. If you adjust for inflation, we spend 17% less per degree than we did 5 years ago, and we're producing 17% more degrees. So you can do it. You can be more efficient. I don't believe we've compromised quality. On the other hand, as I am heard to say pretty often, I worry that we're getting at a point where efficiency is going to affect the quality. And I think that's the balance we have to find in higher education. But efficiency alone is not going to solve the problem for us long term in terms of where the resources are going to come from. It has to be a question of what is our priority. And maybe it's more revenue, but maybe it's how we spend the money that we already have.
Is there an opportunity, and I don't have a view on this, it's just a question. Somebody made the point, I don't remember who it was now, that there's this immense appetite around the world for American education. Did Michael make that point? Well, is there an opportunity for the United States to somehow or other get the benefit of that in terms of funding these really remarkable institutions that we have?
I do believe there is, and I do think that universities should continue to experiment to find effective ways of teaching that are more cost effective. Little Wesleyan is engaging in a pretty big experiment with massive open online courses. We have a few 100,000 people who've taken classes at Wesleyan over the last year. And that's astonishing to me. I know the University of Texas system is also, and the University of North Carolina as well. They've been doing online work for quite a while. We are trying to learn from this mode of teaching how we can be more productive on our campus, but we're also finding that we have hundreds of thousands of people outside the U.S. who want the benefits of an American education. We have yet to figure out how to attach revenue to that. But it's only year 2 or 3 of this mode of education, and I'm confident that we will figure out how to monetize this so that there is an effective revenue stream that's tied to learning that makes a difference in the lives of people around the world.
Yes, Francisco.
Well, first, I think state and federal government needs to understand that education is a priority for this nation, whether for economic vibrancy, for the health of the country, even for the protection of our democracy.
Very importantly, the latter, too.
But I will say, I came at higher ed through a non-traditional route, which is really healthcare. And we've seen a lot of changes in healthcare. And so I was able to take a look with fresh eyes, the environment of higher ed in an academic setting. And let's just talk about the cost of construction. Just a simple people can understand that. And I was asking, well, why is it costing so much per square foot, whether it's academic or wet research lab space? And the answer that I got was, well, we need to have these buildings last 100 years. Well, the last time I was in a building built for 100 years, the water was leaking out of the ceiling, at year 15. And so in regards just to the cost of construction, we have to kind of revisit, how we're constructing our facilities and how we are utilizing our facilities. So we've got billions of dollars committed to our infrastructure, and yet, this is not popular, but Monday mornings, Friday afternoons, our spaces aren't being utilized effectively. And yet, 10,000 students are leaving the state of Texas because they can't get into our flagships. Well, I think we have a compelling case to work with our faculty and our students to kind of change that culture. But, these are hard discussions to have, but the fact is, I don't see revenue streams changing. I don't see a bolus of funds coming at us. The second is, so we need to contain costs and become more productive. I also don't see, if we want to build our research mission, then we have to be more receptive in public-private partnerships.
Absolutely.
That is, developing relationships, let's say with pharma in regards to biomedical research, or let's say with industry in regards to carbon-related or non-carbon-related energy research. And at the same time, we've got to take a look at our conflict of interest policies and commitment policies to make sure that we still protect the pillars of academic freedom. But I don't think we can take a look at state government and federal government to answer all our problems. And that's where leadership needs to surface, and that's where you need a board to kind of provide the adrenaline to get it done.
If you had to make a guess, Tom, and you look at the University of North Carolina, by the way, public-private partnerships, and then well, let me ask you before I actually forget, Tom, the public-private partnerships on the one hand, it struck me for a long time as possibly being part of the solution in the STEM areas at least, not in other areas perhaps. On the other hand, you have the conflict of interest issues. How do you try to resolve that at the University of Texas?
Well, you've got to make certain that, let's say that you do have a relationship with industry, that is fully disclosed. You have to, up front, if you have a partnership with industry, to understand, what the ground rules are, and that, this work, that you can't really, in many ways, compromise the moral values of a university, just for the sake of getting funding. And a variety of universities have done this well, and we've got to be more creative, more flexible, but set the ground rules up front that are appropriate for the university.
So setting the ground rules is what keeps lawyers employed, which is a good thing. I'm a lawyer. We have one of our campus, North Carolina State University Research One, has 700 current relationships with different companies right now. So public-private partnerships are real today in Texas and North Carolina, all over the country. They're helpful, and they're certainly part of the solution. But I do think we've seen in public higher education for sure a shifting of, as was mentioned in the previous panel, a shifting of the cost of higher education to students and families as opposed to society at large. And we've done that by cutting public investments and increasing tuition. There's some that believe that's the right model, that it ought to be a user model because it's about what the private individual gains. I don't feel that way. I think it's an important part of our society. It's part of what has made America stronger than most other countries, and what's made our economy stronger. And I think we've got to, as a nation, decide, do we want to continue to be the nation's leading economy? Do we want to continue to be a democracy that is functioning better than it is today? And if so, then we have to decide to make education a priority. And I don't think MOOCs, though I believe they're here to stay and that they'll have a role to play in higher education, I don't think they're going to be the revenue stream that's going to save us. I don't think public-private partnerships alone are going to be the revenue stream. I think there's going to have to be a commitment from taxpayers and others to support education.
And I think just some follow-up, because we're having a discussion during lunch, is kind of one area that just, it's like a ton of bricks on my back, is, we all want to be held accountable. We want to be transparent. But there appears to be a tsunami of regulatory burdens coming at us. That is, we've got to do A, B, C, D, and E because we don't trust you. And the number of employees that we've had to hire across the University of Texas system is enormous just to meet the compliance burdens that are being put at us. Some of them are very, very needed. Others are a real burden. And I don't know whether both of you have experienced this, but it's something that we need to keep our eyes on.
As I mentioned, we're looking at the number of FTEs that we have employed throughout our system that are there just for compliance purposes. And again, I'm not suggesting we get rid of all of them because I think there are many of the rules and regulations that are very important, but I do think we may have gone overboard and we may be spending a lot of money in that area there where there could be some real savings that could be redirected to the class.
I think an interesting question, Tom, would be this, and roughly, I think it was 2011, I may be wrong, but I think it was, President Obama put in place an executive order saying we must have strong regulation and people must be protected, but on the other hand, we should have a cost-benefit framework. That's not verbatim, but the idea is right. Has the university system been effective in taking these issues around regulation to the executive branch, to OMB actually, something called OIRA, to the executive branch to take a look at the regulatory structure that you face and the regulations? I happen to be familiar with what you say. There are a vast number of new regulations, not recent past. Just have this, to try to get a review of this?
I don't think we've come together as a group of institutions nationally and done that. We should. I know we've tried to do that at our state level, and we've gotten really good reception from the legislature, and we've been able to get rid of some regulations. We still have to build 100-year buildings as well. And we actually had some experiments. They let us try some things with dorms, building with modular units, and it saved a whole lot of money. But the state construction office ultimately won out, and we're back to 100 years.
I should know this, but I don't. There's an organization of American universities. What's it called?
The AAU.
Yeah, AAU.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does the AAU have a concerted effort to deal with the administration around these issues of regulation?
We just, the National Academies just put out a report, and it's free about the future of America's research universities. And it had 10 recommendations, and one very strong recommendation was to actually work with the federal government to eliminate regulatory burdens. I can't say Texas has been very successful addressing that with the federal government. I would say that this year we were very successful in working with the state legislature in eliminating regulatory burdens where there existed duplication. We have a Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. They had to approve construction projects. They had to approve degree programs. They had to approve almost everything we did that the Board of Regents then had to approve. And so we had to go through 2 different approval processes, and it just didn't make sense. And we got the state actually to sunset a lot of that, which in return will save us money that we can reinvest in the mission.
I should just to sound a contrarian note, I mean, there are these redundancies that are, we have to eliminate, but many of the regulations we have is because of past practices that were not good. And so we are forbidden to do those things. And whether it's shoddy construction or it's treating people unequally. I've never, it's always a good thing to say, let's decrease regulatory burden. It's like saying we want to increase excellence. I mean, no one's against it. But the reason we have some regulations is because we still need to have some oversight, I think, or we fall into patterns of behavior that don't serve all our students equally and don't serve our institutions that well. I chafe at redundancies, but I also applaud regulations that give our students power to demand their rights that have been denied over long periods of time.
So does that mean that boards and trustees have to be held more accountable?
I think
because ultimately, that is their fiduciary responsibility.
absolutely. Yeah. So regulations like conflict of interest regulations that have not always been enforced systematically in our sector I think are really important. Just like when bankers complain about overregulation of the banking industry for only 5 years after the debacle, I have to scratch my head.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
think
and
the argument,
let me
Michael,
just
is-
say that I completely agree with what you said. There are
Yeah.
many regulations we need. But on the other hand, I don't know what your budget is, but it's bigger than mine, and mine's $9 billion. And yet I have to get approval anytime somebody in our organization, for whatever reason, is going to get a 10% or larger pay raise. Now, a private enterprise would never have to submit to that kind of regulation. But yet that's expected on so many levels, and that's the kind of flexibility that we need to be able to run our institutions successfully. I'm not suggesting we don't need environmental regulations. I'm not suggesting we don't need regulations to protect our students and their rights. That's not what I'm suggesting. I think we're just held to standards that are different than private sector and often unreasonable.
And I wish to say, I'm in the private sector in a way that your burdens must be much greater than mine.
Michael, let me ask, by the way, I relate to what Tom, what President Obama said was we must have strong regulation, we must protect all those rights, but on the other hand, we also should make sure that we apply a rule of reason. Let me ask you a question. You run a residential college, an outstanding residential college. 10 years from now, in the context of all that is happening, how is it going to look different than it does today?
I hope it's a lot more flexible than it is now. And Wesleyan is known for being pretty flexible already, but I can see that we're breaking the traditional academic calendar up. It's not the only way to go to school as in semester patterns. We are allowing students to decrease the time to degree completion so they can save money. And these things were not accepted with unanimity or with universal applause. But I think there has been a development of creating more opportunities for students who learn differently to complete a high-level, challenging degree in different ways. That will be a challenge for us institutionally. It will be a challenge for our faculty. It'll be a challenge for our institution in fundraising and other areas. But I do think we'll have more non-traditional students on campus. We'll have, I'm sure, tens of thousands of students who are participating in our educational programs who are not on campus. And again, we're a small place, so tens of thousands is a lot for us. Not for you guys, were running much larger operations. But I do think that the attractiveness of a strong residential program seems to me only to have increased. I get notes from students all over the world who are taking online courses with us and say, I wish I could be at Wesleyan. I just had last night I had an email from a young student in China who asked me if I would write her a letter of recommendation because she's one of the 30,000 people in this MOOC I'm teaching, and she wants to apply for Wesleyan, and would this give her a leg up? And it's a perfectly reasonable request, but I don't know how to deal with it yet. So I think that over time, we will have to there'll be more points of access to high quality. I think, and some of my colleagues think this is really dangerous. I actually think it's a fantastic opportunity for American education. If we can create more avenues of access to high quality education, not only will the country benefit, but I think we will retain our prominence internationally.
Ask one final question, then we'll open it up to everybody. Where is the best thought? Well, maybe I want to put this. Is there some place where serious analytic thought is being given, strategic thought to the future of American higher education, to try to think through these kinds of issues, in addition to obviously your own institutions, where you can tell just from the comments you all have made, you're deeply involved with this. Is there a focused? Is there any place where there's a focus? You said the National Academies put out a 10-point program recently. Maybe that's the answer. But is it the kind of focus you need in an industry that obviously is facing enormous change, or is that yet to come? Where would you say we are on the spectrum?
The problem with the National Academy study was really on the future of America's research universities. Right. There are many, many universities serving thousands and thousands of students whose mission is not just research. I do think that organizations like APLU and ACE and even AAU are beginning to look at this because you can't ignore it. I also feel that one of the greatest drivers of innovation right now are what our students want. Mm-hmm. And we've spoken a lot today, but we haven't really spoken about that some of the greatest advocates for change and demand for change are students.
Absolutely.
And if you listen to students very carefully, they certainly want a variety of different accesses to higher ed. A component of online courses, a component of face-to-face courses, and they're demanding it. And so we need to respond to that, because if we don't, I don't think we're doing service to our students. And from a Chancellor of a public university system, I've got to be very sensitive to those students who can't travel to Austin for that flagship experience.
I think, it was interesting when I ran a residential liberal arts college, the average age of a student, I'm betting, I never looked, but I'm betting was 20, 18 to 22. They graduated in 4 years at a 98% rate or something like that. They were there 4 years. The average age of an undergraduate across our system is 23. We have campuses where the average age of an undergraduate is 26. So clearly the mix of students and the way they come to us is vastly different. And it's changing quickly. I think the idea that Michael's put out already, and it's a good one that all of us are looking at and need to look at fast, is how to produce more different delivery methods for students that aren't tied to a typical semester, traditional semester timeline. I mentioned to you earlier, we do a lot of work with the military, and we're trying to design courses that somebody can start and then finish maybe while they've been deployed somewhere. And that we can't tie it to a semester. We've got to look at different delivery methods. We've got to look at the use of technology, but do it in all sorts of different ways, not just MOOCs, but lots of different ways. And I think that's the challenge we all face, is how to do it, but how to do it quickly, because the demand of students is on us, and we've got to figure out how to meet that demand if we're going to be as successful as we need to be.
Let's open it to everybody else. If you do it quickly, Tom, can you bring your faculty along with you?
Can I bring the faculty along?
Yeah.
I think our faculty are leading the way a lot of times.
Let's open it up to everybody. Michael, I know you want to say
I just wanted to put a plug in for the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which has as its members community colleges, Ivy League schools, state systems, and they, in partnership with the Lumina Foundation, are doing a lot of work on degree completion, but also on the quality of the curriculum.
Important work.
Yes, sir. If you can state your question briefly, then we can get a few more questions in. Oops, here are a whole bunch of them from Twitter. See how I say we're modern? Okay.
Hi, I'm Fred Altman, and Dr. Ross pointed out the difference that the costs in healthcare have gone way up, or the amount of support for it has gone way up, and education has gone down. Well, one factor that may be producing that, there's been a lot more research money going into medical research than into education. Would more money for education help? For education research help?
It's a good question. I mean, I think actually that one of the keys to education today is involving students at a much younger age and earlier in their career in research opportunities. So one of the advantages of having a lot of research going on in your campus is, if you take advantage of it, is to expose undergraduates to that research as much as you would graduate students or professional students. And we're seeing that more and more, because I think we're realizing that what employers want and what the kind of talent we need to produce are people that have breadth, that is, that have a strong liberal arts or interdisciplinary background, but also who have had depth experiences like research. So I don't know that it's an either or that we should allow it to be an either or that we should invest more in one place than the other. I think they're both very important to education.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone right there.
Hello, my name is Molly Hyman. I'm a student at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I'm interning in Washington, D.C. this quarter. And I was just wondering, just looking at the panels today, there are no students here, and it seems, looking around the room, there are very few students. So what do you think the role of students is in this whole debate, and how can we become more involved?
That's a good question that somebody actually, I think.
Well,
Francisco said
my response
that's right, yeah.
is students are front and center. And if students aren't front and center, we're going to be often going a misdirected route. And at the end of the day, that's why we exist, is to open up opportunities and allow you all to fulfill your dreams. And we need to listen to our students. Otherwise, we're in the wrong business.
You know, in retrospect, we thought it really should have included a couple of students in this panel. You're right. If we have another one, we'll remember to do that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think how to get involved is, you know, when we see students most often is when we're thinking about raising tuition. And that may be the only time we see them. And that's an important time to see them, but it's not the only time. I think when we're engaging in discussions like this, but on particular issues that affect students and the opportunities they have, they need to be heard. We need to know, because I think the point was made earlier that students are leading the change oftentimes and have ideas about how we could do things better that we don't know. So we're coming at it from our experience, which happened a long time ago, and so your ideas would be very helpful.
So I still take surgical call on the weekends, like every third weekend, and it's an opportunity for me to be with nurses and medical students and health professionals. And I can tell you, so many times a student will say, "Hey, I've got this idea," and many times it resonates, and we carry it forward.
Am I correct, Chancellor? You still do organ transplants, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you need not only a higher education, but an organ transplant, we have a
we can arrange it.
This is what you call multitasking, right? Yeah, well, there are a lot of people, it turns out, but the gentleman over there who's sort of no jacket but a tie. Yeah, there we go.
You've been busted.
Hi, I'm Nick Swartzel. I'm a reporter for the Dallas Morning News. UT alum too, so welcome.
Congratulations.
My question is for the UT Chancellor, but also the others on the panel. There's a lot of talk in Texas, and I think other states too, about reforming higher education, undergraduate degrees. In Texas, it's the $10,000 four-year degree. But there are also some talk about ways to evaluate faculty and things like that that involve student evaluations or the amount of students they bring into a class. And I know that those are two big issues, but if I could get just a brief read on those, what are your opinions on those kind of reforms?
Well, you know, if we go back 2.5 years, it was when you know, there was there was a debate out there whether, you know, our universities embark upon, you know, the 7 breakthrough solutions to higher education and this and that. I would say that it resulted in a catalyst. It was catalytic to really, you know, starting a great conversation, and that was really the impetus for me establishing a framework for advancing excellence, which is really, you know, what we are embarking upon, kind of the setting goals and priorities of what we want to accomplish over the next 5 years. Now, I do believe, as I stated, that student evaluations are important, but one aspect of a total evaluation of a faculty member. So, you know, a lot of discussion. I think debate is always a good thing, and it really allowed us to establish a framework that set priorities. So, you know, from my perspective, tension is always a good thing. It caused a lot of tension, but it also allowed us to set priorities.
Let me ask you a question that somebody sent in on Twitter, which is, I think, pretty germane to our whole discussion, which is the dropout rate is still very high in college. So you have this enormous resource that goes into training people, or the beginning of the education of people, and they drop out, which is obviously a very serious problem for them and also for our society. What thoughts do we have about reducing the dropout rate substantially? Tom?
Well, I think one of the things we've learned is that we went through a period of open access where we pretty much said, come on in, no matter what your background and experience and what your educational level is, and I think that was a mistake. I think what we've now done is raise admission standards, work with our community colleges to shift remediation work to the community colleges to try to create a pathway through community colleges directly to our four-year institutions in a seamless way. So I think there's some things we've done that are going to help improve retention and reduce dropouts in that regard. But I'll tell you, an increasing amount of the problem is around resources, around financial aid. You know, students, many of them today are working 2 or 3 jobs in their own financial aid, and it's hard. And sometimes they'll stop out, as we call it, in order to work for a while before they come back, and sometimes they don't come back. And so I think we've got to look at the financial structure of how it is we can support students and keep them on track to graduation, reduce their cost, and there's a lot of that we've already talked about, but that's got to be the key too.
Well, I think in follow-up to that is one also has to take a look at how public universities are funded. And in Texas, at least, a lot of the funding that comes to our universities is based on enrollment growth. And so, if you just take a look at some of the universities, I would say we were accepting students, that probably would not make it. And so, my sense is that, part of the solution is having to raise your admission standards, as many of our universities have done, but just like in healthcare, we're going to start seeing more funding being based on outcomes.
Yeah,
and, it's just going to happen.
Well, just like in healthcare, I guess, if you have healthier people come into the hospital, they don't die as often as if you took really sick people. And I think it's that balance, right, of trying to figure out when is a student really unprepared to do college work, and when can that student with the proper support system actually have success. Now we're much smaller. We have a different admissions process than the large public universities, but we for a long time take bets on students who don't meet conventional criteria of academic preparedness. We know how to get a 98% graduation rate. We don't want a 98% graduation rate because that means we're not actually taking any risks. We want to take students who don't look like they're the best bet for success, but we can't just let them in. That's something I have had to learn. It's not enough to just let that person in and see if they can swim. You have to, some things you can do to really increase dramatically their chances for success. And I do think there's research on that now, and a lot of great schools are seeing improvements in their graduation rates, but it does take resources.
But I also think it's exceedingly important to have great partnerships with your community colleges.
Yep.
Absolutely.
It's just part of it.
Yep.
And I think the other thing we can do, and we as big data continues to mature, we can do a better job of predicting who is likely to be successful by looking at the success of students that we take. By using good analytics, it may not. The idea of you got to have this SAT or ACT and this grade point to be successful is sort of artificial. There may be ranges in there and fluctuations that if we use analytics, we can determine better who's likely to be successful. But you also have to have partnerships with community colleges, with K through 12, to help students to be prepared
Tom,
and to understand what it takes to do college work.
As Michael just described, I know at Harvard they've done what you've said, Michael. Do you have remedial programs for people who have a lot of promise but nevertheless haven't had the benefit of a K through 12 education?
We have moved most of that to our community colleges because it can be provided at less cost to the taxpayers. And so, yes, we do a lot of remediation, but it's done primarily in our community colleges. We've moved it out of the four-year institutions, and that's been the right move.
Time is up, but I want to ask one more question just because it bothers me. But time is up. You mentioned metrics and measuring, which obviously is extremely important, but what always has bothered me, and maybe it bothers me, maybe I'm wrong to be bothered with this. I was going to major in philosophy and decided not to, but I came very close to it. If I had majored in philosophy, there's probably no metric that you would have had that would have thought that I was successful. I wouldn't have been able to, you said to me earlier, Tom, there weren't large number of employers for people who graduated with philosophy. I don't know what you would have measured. Did I understand the meaning of life or something? I don't know. It seems to me metrics can misguide our academic system away from sort of the great traditional values of education. I don't know, maybe that thought is right or wrong, but we'll wind up with a very brief response to that if somebody has it.
I will also tell you that I'm the strongest supporter for the humanities and the arts.
No,
and my undergraduate education was very rich in the humanities and the arts. You can't really measure that. And in fact, it gave me the tools to be able to navigate from a young surgeon to be able to lead a health science center, or now, one of the most complex and largest institutions of higher education in America. And so it's going to be impossible to measure the impact of that type of education, but it's fundamental also to the vibrancy of our nation.
Although I will say, I think we are going to see real advancements in how we measure certain core competencies that we know we're trying to produce, whether it's critical thinking or writing or oral communications or quantitative reasoning. And we're going to be able to measure that much better, I think, as we move forward using technology. And so I think we can measure it, but I think the mistake is that we go down a road of tying success to what your major is somehow, because I think that's not really what we ought to be trying to accomplish.
Mike will give you the last word.
So just a fact, I believe this is accurate, that the average philosophy major makes significantly more than the average business major. And there are good reasons for that if you think about it for 5 minutes. But there aren't too many philosophy majors compared to business majors.
There's not a lot of demand for them either, but and it's too late for me to change my major, but go ahead.
I do think this is a debate as old as this country, that ever since the founding of this country, there's been a debate about the value of a kind of education that you can't quantify the effects of right away, and how it contributes to the polity and how it contributes to the culture of this country. And I think we shouldn't try to settle the debate. We should just keep the debate alive. We shouldn't let the technocrats jump in and say it's all got to be by metrics of earnings, and we shouldn't let the softies come in and say it's got nothing to do with anything but the meaning of life. That debate between practicality and broad education is, I think, at the heart of this country's success.
Thank you all. You were terrific.